Let's talk a little bit about Soviet Union and religious liberty in the Soviet Union. It's a very important question, I think, because if they're going to make reforms, I think that religious liberty will have to be part of it. I know you and I were at a conference there and with one of their think tanks and talked a lot about how American business works, but the real upshot of it was that the Soviets were hearing it in terms of what's going to make their economy work. In other words, we were talking about our system, but they were hearing it in terms of how this would change their system or what they could learn. And some of our important presentations were given by Harold Berman, a former professor at Harvard and a great legal expert on the Soviet Union, and you also gave fine presentations on the importance of law and how it works in the United States. And so Professor Berman gave us a copy of a draft law on USSR notions of freedom of conscience and a commentary on it. In other words, this is something that's not even that I hold in my hands at this moment, that is not widely known in the Soviet Union itself. In fact, to my knowledge, has never been published in the Soviet Union, but it is being published in the Harvard Human Rights Journal. And what the Soviets did was draft a document on freedom of conscience and then circulate it with certain American experts to see what they would think about it. And so I'm holding that very document in my hand. But before we go on with that, let's just talk a little bit about the religious liberty that exists in the Soviet Union and maybe how you've seen it change over the years, because you have visited now for a number of years, I know.
Yes, I think let's start by just, if we might, Jim, because by giving some background. Everyone knows, of course, that when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, one of the first things they did was to establish atheism as the official teaching or the official doctrine of the state. And many churches were closed, and while it may be true that there were constitutions, there have been 2 or 3 constitutions since 1917, which, in words anyway, gave to people freedom to believe, there were severe restrictions on the practice of religion. For example, while churches could function, churches were controlled in many respects by the state. Many of the churches were closed, and in order for but nevertheless, the leaders of the churches, particularly the Russian Orthodox Church, had to clear everything they did with representatives of the state. So the state kept firm control over the operation of the church in the Soviet Union.
Now, which is primarily the Russian Orthodox Church.
The Russian Orthodox Church.
Although other churches did exist.
Yes, other churches did exist. Mm-hmm. So there was this, and so there has been, and still is, although it's changing, an uneasy relationship between organized religion and the state. The purpose, of course, or the aim of the Bolsheviks was to fully secularize the Soviet Union. And they were going to create, as you have pointed out on other occasions, a new Soviet man and woman. The power of science and the powers of human creativity were going to be turned into creating this utopian state in which people would be wiser and smarter and more creative than any other people on this earth. Well, of course, it's all fallen apart at the core, and we would, I'm sure, agree that one of the reasons it's falling apart is that it simply ignored the truth about human nature, the great truths which have been recognized in our Western religious and philosophical traditions, that no matter how smart man becomes, or no matter how far we go in science, we are not going to change human nature or eliminate what we refer to as original sin. Mm-hmm.
One of the great things Marx forgot in his whole analysis was original sin.
And he did indeed. But in any event, there's been this very uneasy relationship under communist rule between the organized church and the state.
Tom, when you're saying organized church, let's just look at the diversity of that just a minute, because we're not just talking Russian Orthodoxy, are we? We're talking Islam, which is, for example, in the Republic of Azerbaijan, the Islamic religion is the dominant one. To the best of my knowledge, the Soviets really never could completely stamp out Islam or the whole system of mosques there or anything.
They didn't come close.
Yeah.
And they've never...
Did they make a serious effort at it?
Well, they made an effort, but keeping in mind that when you talk about the Central Asiatic republics, those who were sent from Moscow to control things in the local government, nevertheless were a tiny minority living among people of many different traditions. There are more than 100 different nationalities living in the Soviet Union. And
it's hard for people to just keep in mind the size of the Soviet Union. It spans 11 time zones. Mm-hmm. I think, what is it, about 1/6 or 1/7 of the land mass on this globe is the Soviet Union, and almost 300 million people. I mean, you're dealing with an immense, vast system here. And of course, we've known lately with the Azerbaijanis and Islam being so powerful there, one of the conflicts is with Armenia, which is Christian. Mm-hmm. And that seems to create great difficulty. So they've known their religious wars as well.
Yeah, when you mention Azerbaijan and Armenia, you have to keep in mind you're mentioning only 2 of the 15 republics, and there are autonomous republics in addition to the 15 main republics which make up the Soviet Union. And so keeping that in mind, we have to recognize that approximately half the people living in the Soviet Union are not Russians, and of those who are, as you've already pointed out, who are not Russians, approximately 150 million in number, a large percentage of those people are Muslims. And so they are not about, either on nationalistic grounds or on religious grounds, to take orders from Moscow from people who call themselves communists and adhere to the teachings of someone they don't know about and don't care about, i.e. Marx and Lenin and so forth. And so...
or let's take the Baltic republics. There you have a large Catholic community in Lithuania, united with the Rome. In the Ukraine, you got 5 million Uniate Christians united with Rome. So the religious mix is immense. You got Islam, a large number of Muslims. You've got Russian Orthodoxy, which is sort of the official religion and the one that the state deals with most directly, with the patriarch in Moscow and so on, and really at the root of Russian culture ever since 988 when it was brought into the Soviet Union. You have a thriving Baptist community in Moscow, and I don't know if I think in Leningrad also. You have Catholic churches in Moscow and in Leningrad. And yes, you do. You have a strong evangelical tradition that has come into the Soviet Union since back the time of Catherine the Great and onward in the 18th century. So, yes, there's a long tradition of sects, as we say, the groups that are not even the mainline Protestant churches. And, another thing that was very strong in the Soviet Union was Masonry. Masonry, very powerful.
Yes, very powerful.
And so you've got many either religions or quasi-religions functioning in the Soviet Union. As you pointed out, often under great repression, but the Soviets were not able to completely stamp it out.
No.
There always were churches that remained open.
Always churches open, and not only were churches open, but many people who, for practical reasons, wouldn't go to church because they didn't want to be identified as a believer, nevertheless were believers and had their children baptized in the church, sometimes surreptitiously. They would go to the priest and have a child baptized. And we now know that something like 50% of all the funerals which took place even after the Bolshevik Revolution, in the worst times, I should say, of communist rule, some 50% of funerals were religious funerals. And while we were being told that young people were getting married in the Palace of Weddings in civil ceremonies, we now know that a large percentage of those young people were going off from the civil ceremony to be married in religious ceremonies. So the truth is now beginning to surface, all by way of saying that any rulers who would try to ignore these realities that we have been talking about were heading for trouble, and certainly they've got all the trouble they can handle. So now the question becomes, is as a attempt to restructure their political and economic system, the catchword that they have picked up from their language to capture the idea of reform and restructuring of the political economic system is perestroika, which everyone's heard continuously now since Gorbachev has come to preeminence. So the question is, what are they going to do about liberating people? So liberating people in the sense of their right to practice openly their religion and to be invigorated and energized by their religious freedom.
I thought it was interesting that when we were talking to one of the think tanks in the Soviet Union, and that was our job there, a 2-day conference, and to address the question of what makes American business practices work. And my job as a theologian was to talk about the cultural factors, the cultural ethos and philosophy of the United States, and especially I brought out the religious dimension. And I thought the reaction of the audience, 220 people from 100 different cities, was interesting, to say the least. I mean, one might have expected them to be rather against all of this religious talk, but it turned out to be just the opposite. And I think it was one of you recall this maybe at the end of the conference when one of their leaders of the Supreme Soviet got up and made comment on that. Do you want to sort of recall what that happened there?
I'd like to set the stage, Jim, because what we're going to be describing or talking about is the reaction to your talk about the importance of religion in understanding the cultural ethos of the United States. And it was one of the most stunning and overwhelming experiences that I've had in my life. And if you'll allow me, I think the listeners would be interested in some background as to how that came about. And by that I mean, how did it happen that a theologian, a moral teacher and moral leader from the United States, you, Jim Bacik, ended up in a huge auditorium in Moscow talking to leaders from 100 different cities throughout the Soviet Union, most of whom were communists. And just a little background, because I think it says something perhaps about us, we Americans, as well. You know, an active businessman asked me to consider making a proposal to a memo. That's the think tank, leading economic think tank that we were dealing with. And he asked me to do it because he knew I had a lot of experience in putting together seminars. And so I wrote up a proposal, and in it I said, I don't think you can really understand America. The idea was to help them understand us so that they could do better, they could better relate to us in business relationships. And my proposal was basically that I didn't think they could understand America and what we really care about and believe in and how we see the world unless they understood the importance of religious traditions and beliefs in America. And this very far-sighted businessman took that to the director of a memo, and for reasons which I don't understand and I still trying to comprehend, they like the idea. And then I asked you if you would consider playing that role in this conference, and you did. And I also, in that proposal, felt that you should be the first speaker, because it seems to me that you cannot understand the foundations of America unless you understand the theological and moral foundations that hold us together as a people. So you stood before the group and talked about this very subject. And when our 2-day conference was over, I will never forget, I think you had been called out of the room at that time, but a man who had caught my attention because he seemed to be sort of a stereotypical Russian, someone that an American filmmaker might portray, as the KGB man who would be the enforcer, a big burly fellow. got up and asked to be recognized, and it turned out he was a member of the Supreme Soviet, one of their newly elected, what would be, in this country, our Congress, our National Congress. And he asked to be recognized, and he went to the podium, and he said, and he began in typical communist parlance, said, "Comrades, I think we owe a debt of gratitude to our American friends for coming and sharing their thoughts and experiences with us. But I want to say especially that I appreciate the fact that you Americans thought enough of us to share your religious beliefs. And I have particularly appreciated the comments of Dr. Bacik about religion and the importance of religion and philosophy in America." And then he turned to the audience and said, "Comrades, it's high time that in the Soviet Union we began paying more attention to the spiritual needs of our people."
It was a remarkable kind of statement, and it played into something that in the beginning of my talk I had quoted President Gorbachev, who said that if perestroika was really going to work, that the spiritual dimension had to be taken into consideration. And I think that is the tremendous turnaround we're seeing. I contrast Gorbachev with Khrushchev in this regard. Khrushchev, I think, was a true believer in Marxist thought that religion's the opiate of the people, and he was sort of a liberal reformer, but he was very much against the churches and made extra effort to sort of squash the religious dimension within the Soviet Union. And here's Gorbachev turning this around and going totally against the Marxist principle here and saying, no, religion will be a factor in making the economic reform work, that there is the spiritual world must be taken into consideration. And so I guess you and I were both just very taken aback by the depth of that feeling on their part and the pervasive character of that notion, especially in a society that has been officially atheistic for 70 years and teaching Marxist-Leninism to the students over and over. And here still you have this revival, and you got a deputy of the Supreme Soviet standing up and saying, "Comrades, we must remember the religious spiritual dimension of all of this," echoing in this case his leader, President Gorbachev. So I guess that sets the stage for, returning to this religious liberty thing and this document that I have in my hands here of that they are now debating in their legislature, which will give great freedoms. Tom, let me read you a couple of the statements here because I think they're very revealing. It says here, this is a quote from the draft law, "Freedom of conscience is one of the basic constitutional rights of citizens of the USSR, secured effectively by Soviet legislation." And it says, "We must have this law of freedom of conscience and on religious organizations which guarantees citizens the right to determine voluntarily and independently their relationship to religion and in accordance with this belief the unimpeded performance of religious practices, both individually and together with others." I mean, isn't that is a remarkable kind of statement. Let me just a couple more. "Every citizen shall have the right freely and independently to determine his relationship to religion," and so on. And then it goes on to parents. "Parents or persons serving in their stead shall have the right to secure the religious and moral upbringing and training of their children in accordance with their own beliefs." I mean, this has to be good news. They can even practice their religion. This is Article 4. It's quite a long document, by the way. "Religious rites and ceremonies shall be conducted without hindrance in and around houses of worship and in religious institutions, as well as in apartments and houses of citizens." So, I mean, it begins to give us a feel here for the scope of this document and this newfound notion that we must grant freedom of religion to all of the people in the Soviet Union, whether they're practicing Islam or Roman Catholicism or the Baptist version of Protestantism or the Russian Orthodox official church.
Yes, those are beautiful and powerful words and encouraging words, but I think we have to recognize that there have always been words in the Soviet Constitution, and even if they were to pass that proposed law of religious freedom in the Soviet Union today, it would still be necessary to institutionalize the freedom necessary to live out the promises in the old Constitution and in that draft law on religious freedom. And that raises the question now as to whether or not this restructuring of the Soviet Union will in fact succeed to the point where the freedom to practice religion in deed and actions will become a reality, notwithstanding anything that may be written in the laws. And that's, of course, the great question today, which has caused the entire world to focus its attention on what's happening in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's something that is going to be continued to be debated, I guess. But as you point out, I mean, it's one thing to have a law, and they've always had a law about a lot of things, but it's not been carried out in practice. But I think, did we not sense, when we were in the Soviet Union, a new spirit of freedom that really can't be squashed anymore? There was some of the commentators have been saying lately that the only possible way to really quench that spirit again would be of a dictator to come along of the nature of Stalin, but who would have even a more difficult time than Stalin, who would have to use brutal repression and spill the blood of his people and incur great unpopularity to get things back to the way they were before. In other words, the forces of freedom have been unleashed in such a way that it can't be put back in a bottle anymore. And I think that we see that here with the question of the religious freedom. Now, there were people all the way along the line. I had a friend who went to the Soviet Union a number of years ago and said she visited Baptist churches, and the people went freely. I mean, and they were there worshiping. They knew as a result there would be penalties, economic penalties. They wouldn't be allowed to travel. I think they wouldn't get promoted, get a better job or anything like that, but they were willing to practice their faith. And it's I think in many ways it has strengthened the religious traditions in the Soviet Union. So they did it even then. But now, I mean, you really do sense there's a new openness. And it's so important in their tradition. I mean, what are you going to say about an atheistic country that when they bring you to look at whatever they think is important, takes you to the Kremlin, and inside the Kremlin you have all these churches with icons depicting the whole story of the Bible. I mean, this is the art they show you. This is the great treasure. What is the thing you see on television? St. Basil's Cathedral. I mean, it's quite remarkable. Atheistic system trying to stamp this out, but they really never could do it because it's so much at the center of their being. Mm-hmm. And it has really been the driving force of their culture in many ways. So this law will, therefore, we hope, further this whole process. But I take it your point is that unless it's enshrined in legal institutions, it won't have any teeth. And I think that Harold Berman, the great expert on the Soviet legal system, taught at Harvard and currently teaches at Emory, has written a commentary on this, and I think backing up your point. He says at a number of places that, well, that's nice, but unless you've got sort of some organizational procedure here or some fundamental rule of law, we aren't going to be able to put this into practice.
Yeah, I think the way it's going to play out, Jim, is that we will see and continue to see, as we're now seeing, both good results and bad results of this increased freedom. Let me explain. The good results, of course, are that people now have this sense of freedom to express themselves, the sense of freedom about going to church to practice their faith, and as a result, the churches are overflowing. The number of applicants to the seminaries in the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, have in recent years have more than doubled. There is this explosion of interest in religion, which is manifested by a substantial increase in the number of Bibles that are being printed, availability of religious literature, books, some of them from the Russian tradition that were suppressed under communism are now being released, the books which have religious themes. So all those are good results of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, that is the restructuring of the political economic system, the move now towards a multi-party democratic political system. The bad signs which raise the question of the possibilities which lurk in this period of great ferment and change, the bad signs, or I shouldn't say bad signs, but the signs of things that could turn into deep crisis are there also. For example, crime is going up. crime on the streets is shooting up. So that today, unlike the first time I visited the Soviet Union, when it was entirely safe to walk the streets of Moscow and Leningrad at night without worrying about being mugged or robbed, there's a breakdown now of a sense of legality, or a sense that you will be punished for those sort of things. So there are more criminals afoot, more hooliganism. You and I, for example, took a walk one evening
Tom, you're
on
going to
the
have to
streets
tell
of
the
Moscow.
story quickly.
Yeah, I will tell us. Oh, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Well, what we saw was young, restive people with nothing to do being rounded up by the police on the street corners of Moscow.
And defying the police. That's what
And
blew
defying
my
the
mind.
police. And so what could happen, you could have a breakdown of law and order, the economy could collapse, and you could have a return to a strong man like Stalin. Let's hope and pray that doesn't happen.
Tom, we've been talking about the Soviet Union and the whole question of religious liberty. We tried to see some background to that, and you well pointed out to us the repression that occurred, but the inability of them to totally stamp out religion, probably because it's built into the human psyche, and part of what it means to be human is to have a religious thirst and quest in our hearts. And the Russian Orthodox Church has remained alive, as well as Islam, which is a major part of the Soviet Union. So, and the Catholic population, Baptist, and so on. So we've seen that pluralism, and we've tried to look at this new law that is really wide-ranging and is giving freedom of conscience to the people. Question is now, will they be able to put it into practice? Will they find the institutional framework which allows the religious liberty law to work well? And I'm convinced in the midst of all that, we're going to continue to see a revival of religion in the Soviet Union.